Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to New York Times bestseller Mark Oshiro about Jasmine is Haunted. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Also, it is still really surreal to hear New York Times bestseller. I didn't think that would ever happen, so thank you for saying it. I'm really excited about that.
Well, it looks like I'm a little bit more credible than I am if a New York Times bestseller talks to me, so that's all right.
I appreciate it.
So there were some similarities between Jasmine and myself, which I will share, and then I'll ask you to share what Jasmine is Haunted is about. So unlike Jasmine, I didn't move so often growing up, but I went to 6 different schools before I graduated high school.
Yeah.
So I really felt Jasmine's pain, or, when you have so much change in your life, it's very unusual.
I also love that you started with this too. I did an interview yesterday where I spent a lot of time talking about why I keep gravitating towards writing middle grade and young adult, which is it is a period in our lives in which change is always a constant, but there's like back-to-back changes over and over and over. And I love writing about these sort of transitional periods in people's lives. And I was someone who had a huge, very dramatic move when I was 8 years old, where I moved states, so completely to a different part of the country. And it is a very painful experience. And it's sort of the root of what then becomes sort of Jasmine's larger story, which we're going to get into.
Yes. So give the audience an overview of what Jasmine is Haunted is about.
Yes. Okay.
One more
I have not opened the box. Came this morning. I haven't opened it of the final copy. This is the ARC. But yes, it is our lovely. This is Jasmine right here. So Jasmine is Haunted is about a 13-year-old girl named Jasmine Garza who, unfortunately, has had to move every year from one apartment to another because she has had a very pesky ghost follow her from apartment to apartment. And there's sort of 2 things complicating it. One, her mother is essentially in denial. It is ignoring the very obvious reasons why they're moving and doesn't really talk about this spirit that seems to be following her. And then Jasmine is also just a little bit resentful because this ghost is very clearly not the spirit of her recently departed father. And it just appears to be a random ghost that just annoys her. That's all it does, is annoy her and ruin potential friendships. So she starts at this new school, and her mom just has one request for her. She's in 8th grade. Could you just make a friend? Be normal. So the least normal kids in the entire school, because of course she does. So here we have on the left of the cover is Jorge. This is Bea. She meets the only 2 kids who are in the school's gay-straight alliance, which is secretly to actually mean is not the GSA as we understand it. It is the Gay Supernatural Alliance. The little supernatural investigators investigating all things weird and spooky in their school, which of course aren't real. And I love the first case she learns about is the Sasquatch on campus, which I'm not going to spoil what it ends up being. But they then meet this girl who has verifiable proof that the supernatural is real. So these 2 kids decide that they're going to take Jasmine on as a case and determine why she is haunted. And so it is a book not only about this very spooky, very funny mystery. For me, it is a chance to very, very sort of openly discuss grief. And the metaphor for her moving is also a metaphor. Like, there's so many different layers to the metaphor of grief in here. But it is about, it's been 4 years since her father passed away, and she still is sad, and she still misses him. And she has this ghost following her that's not her dad. Like, come on. Like, what are the odds? Like,
get in line with the right house.
Yeah, come on. And so it's also about generational trauma and the fears that, you do eventually find out why her mom refuses to talk about it. And I wanted this book to be about this kid who has a secret and then slowly tells the secret to everyone, and how much keeping a secret is also very painful, which, even though this book is about kids who are out and there's no homophobia, it has that queer element to it of we all grew up having to keep a secret, and how painful it is to not be able to tell everyone who you are. And so, it's a little bit about Jasmine is Haunted.
I love that. And I think so often as adults, we don't mean to do it, but I think oftentimes adults are dismissive of kids, especially when you get to be an
Yeah.
early teen, because adults have been through that time period. So of course we know all the answers and we think we can fix everything. Sometimes that fixing, as you say about Jasmine's mom, there are things she doesn't want to talk about because she too is grieving. And
Yeah.
and a lot of times we think that if we bottle it up, it protects kids. And I think it does just the opposite. I think sadly, it tortures kids because
Hmm.
kids naturally want to fix things. That's what children do. And so when you close a child off because of grief, that child is double hurting now because they're trying to fix something they can't fix.
And I think one of the things I really wanted to try to do with this was, especially in the middle grade space, like the readers of this book will be 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, is present a parent who is very complicated, who is not like the perfect supportive parent, but isn't a bad person at all. And I know from interacting with some of the younger readers who have read it, most of their questions actually are about the mom, where they're like, oh, I started this book being super mad at Jasmine's mom, and then by the end of the book I felt really sad for her and I wanted to hug her, and then I was like, oh, I get why she made the choices that she did. And then they're like grappling with like, oh, because part of this book is also Jasmine seeing her mom as a whole person, which isn't, I remember doing that as a child too, about the adults in my life. You see them in this very specific way, and once you start seeing that they are also sometimes struggling and maybe they don't all have all of the answers, your sort of worldview and your view of the adults around you just ever starts to shift. And so yeah, it was really important that I wanted this to not seem, or at least it would not be an easy journey to sort of understand and go through the experience of Jasmine with this specific type of parent. And there are other adults in the book who do very complicated and very funny things. And I just wanted to, I don't know, I like writing messy adults in books for kids because we're messy. We don't have all the answers. Like we don't have all
No,
the
and
answers.
we oftentimes we think we do, but we
Yeah,
damn sure don't.
we
So, and
don't.
I think that was so. They sort of called themselves weirdos. The kids did, and then
Yeah.
I looked at some of them's parents, and I'm like, ooh, I think they're a bigger weirdo than you are.
Yeah, in particular, and you don't meet them until later in the book, but Bea's parents were so much fun to write. And also one thing that someone taught me probably about a decade ago was this concept that you can know a person and understand them and love them, but sometimes when you meet their family for the first time, you're like all the pieces of the puzzle fall into
They
place.
fall into place. That's right.
And so Jasmine has this idea of who Bea is and why she acts the way she does. And then she meets Bea's parents and she's just like, oh, wait a second. Okay, wait. And she doesn't know. And then she sometimes doesn't even know how to feel about this person she does consider a friend. She's just like, oh, this is very intense. I've never met parents like this, And then like her Thea, oh, I love her. Like her Thea
Oh,
is like, oh, I love
oh,
her so much.
Selena is someone that everyone will fall in love with because
Yes.
she gets it. She's in my generation. She would be that hippie aunt or
Yes.
uncle that comes into your life, who's just smoked
It's
out
who
in
I
the
want to
car.
be. Like that's who I want to be. And
Right?
like when I'm going into, I want to tell you the best compliment I ever got, which was in a school visit from a teacher after, I met with like 60, 70 kids during this like kind of big assembly thing. And after all the students left, the teacher came up to me and was like, I've never seen these kids so animated and so into the conversation. Normally, if they see an adult, they don't want to have anything to do with them. And she just kind of looked at me and she's like, you kind of the whole time you were like their gay uncle. And I was like, oh, that's all I want to hear. Like that's incredible. And so
That's like the best
that's
ever.
her energy is here is someone who's always been off the beaten path, who has never ever conformed to what anyone else does. And of course she's going to have friction with her sister, who's a little more I wouldn't say politically conservative, but like more conserved,
Yes,
I'll say.
yes.
She's reserved, she keeps to herself. But I just loved having this beautiful spirit of a woman, very queer woman too, who's just like, I am loud and ridiculous, and this is who I am, and I kind of don't care. And I love that Jasmine has that to sort of look up to. And then, of course, the parallel with her and Bea, too. They're almost kindred spirits in a way, but one of them is much, much younger. And I don't know. I love that kind of energy in a book.
I agree with you. And I also want to compliment you on a couple of things you did with both Ms. Chen and Mr. Winters,
Yes.
because you gave us two adults who are in a school setting who are very supportive and loving to the kids and as understanding as they can be within their world. And I just love that. And I love the fact that Ms. Chen asked Jasmine about a pen on her backpack. Rather than ask Jasmine about Jasmine, she asked about the pen. And I thought, what a perfect way to open the door, because everyone wants a bit of connection.
Yeah. I have to give credit that it wasn't initially my idea. I watched a teacher do that once. And I was like, oh, that's so, get them. And then I asked them about it, and said almost exactly what you said, which is get them to talk about themselves because it feels less invasive, and just being like, oh, I like that pin. What's that pin for? And then they get the chance to make it their story and whatnot. And I think about that too, especially being an openly queer author who is actually, doing bookstore events, who's going into schools. I mean, I'm about to visit like 13 or 14 schools in the next like 3 or 4 weeks for Jasmine is Haunted. And over the years, I have been come out to more times than I can count, which is one, obviously very flattering and such a moving experience. And I'm sure when someone trusts you, but then there's also, it's like a double-edged sword, because the other side of it is I am a total stranger and I'm the safest person in your life.
Oh, Lord.
Right? I'm always thinking in these, when I do my presentations, and certainly when I'm going to be talking about Jasmine, I just present the story as it is. I will always casually mention that it's queer, that this is, the Gay Straight Alliance, all of these sort of things, and just present it as it is. And thinking about how do you engage in conversation, because there are going to be kids who maybe have never heard of a GSA, who have never met a person who is queer at all. Like, so a lot of times I'm going to schools where kids are literally like, "Oh, you're actually gay," and I'm like, "Yes," and they meet it in genuine, right? Right, every day I'm just like, "Oh, you are." But coming from that place of, I always want, and it's something I'm learning through therapy of is to approach scenarios with grace and curiosity. And when someone says something like that, being curious, why are you asking if that's free? Can you talk a little bit more about that? Do you have more you want to ask? And so I think in this book, the other side of it was Jasmine's journey with grief, and certainly many of the other characters with grief can get pretty intense at sometimes. And so I wanted to make sure, and I've done this in some of my other books, that is sort of the only thing they have to worry about. I didn't want to add the extra layer of, oh, these kids are worried about coming out, or these kids are worried about not feeling safe. I wanted that to be as supportive and as, beautiful and loving as possible. But there is still a lot of conflict that's going on. And so, I mean, it's part of the reason I set it in Los Angeles. This is my first time setting. I mean, even though I'm from LA, it's the first time I'm setting a book in LA, and so from visiting schools there, this is as accurate as it is. Sometimes the GSAs aren't big, but they're there, and the kids, they're not being made fun of. It's kind of accepted. It's just a part of the school. Very different from when we were.
Yes, it is. And different. I will say that you did everything except say they were standing in front of Akbar. I've been on that very corner before.
I thought about it, and because I used to live around the corner. So literally lived around the corner. That's one of my favorite neighborhoods. And I just had a moment where I was like, should I just, I'm like, it's a little great book. They don't need that much information. It's so funny you say that, because the scene I wanted to put it in is the sort of epilogue when they're walking to the play. I'm not going to say what it is. I wanted to make a mention of it there, and was like, maybe I shouldn't mention a bar to 10-year-olds. But anyway.
Well, that's true.
Thank you.
But of course, I noticed it because I've been in and outside of that bar more than one time. So,
yeah.
I know the school too, because I was thinking when they were walking to school, I was sitting there scratching my head, and I'm like, oh yes, when you go down the dip, there's the school on the left. So I've totally vibed on the entire Los Angeles.
I mean, I made up the name and whatnot, but that whole neighborhood I tried to make as accurate as possible. I've already had kids who got an advance copy from LA be like, I want you to know that intersection is still the most terrifying thing on the planet. And I'm like, oh, thank you. It's been terrifying me for years.
Well, you
Makes no
don't. I
sense.
mean, it's hard to know sometimes. Let's say if you were going from Akbar to the oil change place, it's hard
Yeah.
to know which way you're supposed to go because it's a 5-way point, and it's like, oh, that's crazy. So I do want to mention because we have been talking about death and
Yeah.
dying, and I
Yeah.
never think that is. I never think that's overdone because I think it's conversations we really have to have as humans. But I
Yeah.
also want to mention that your book is filled with hope.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to go along with death and dying is hope, because I would assume as an author, you have hope on your mind because you're going to be dealing with some dark subjects here. But,
Yeah.
the fact that there's hope and it's sort of like that little saying, no child left behind. I felt like we didn't leave any characters behind either.
Yeah.
You had no throwaway characters. Everyone served a
No.
purpose.
Oh no, 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 not especially with what happens in the end. Like this was very I would say it was very hard to design it so that it was that way. Like there were multiple drafts to figure out, and sometimes there were characters who got cut because I couldn't fit them in to that feeling. But I did really want it to not feel like any of the secondary or tertiary characters were throwaway characters. And so it's actually very interesting where even if I go to the root of this idea, I kind of can't say what the actual idea is because it's a spoiler for the ending.
Got you.
So I will say what the ending is what the original idea was, and I had been sitting on it for about 7 or 8 years now. I got the idea back in like 2017, 2018. Oh no, 2016, 2017 was before my first book was even published or had even been sold. And I was like, oh, this is a cool idea. I'd love to write something about this. And then about 2 years ago, it was 2 years ago when I started doing school visits in person again because we went through a long period of doing everything virtual. So I was in New York, I was doing a school visit, and the kids were like, one of the kids was like, I'm so glad you're here in person. We didn't like the virtual visits last year. And I was like, don't worry, we didn't like them either.
No.
I hated them. And I did them because it was important and I wanted to make the connection, but I found them very draining. I found that there wasn't that exchange of energy because they're just talking to a computer screen. And so the kids were like, oh, well, it probably wasn't that bad for you because you live in Atlanta. And I was like, well, I was here in New York at the beginning of the pandemic. So I spent the first year and a half and we just started having a conversation about the pandemic and we're talking about it. And at one point, the kids are talking like some kid was like, I lost my best friend. I lost my uncle. Another one was like, I lost one of my parents. And there's like this very sort of somber pall to the room. And this kid just says, just like, maybe like 5 beats of silence and just goes, why haven't we been talking about this? And God, it was such a heavy moment. And I was like, and then I was very honest. I was like, living in New York, I was in Brooklyn when the pandemic, I lost 17 people in 6 months.
Oh my Lord, Mark.
And I'm of various, from acquaintances to people I was really close with because New York had it the worst. It was like living in a horror movie. So here I am with these kids who also lived through that. And they were like, I have relatives in other places who like were in the house for a week and they have no idea what it was like. And that idea of why don't we talk about this? We ended up having this wonderful conversation. I left the school visit and I spent weeks thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about this kid just being like, why don't we talk about it? And I would say it was probably within 6-7 months. I was just looking through I have this notes app. In my notes app, I have a pin note that's like story and book ideas. And the idea that I can't say because it'll spoil what the book is about or the mystery of the book, I looked at it and was like, oh, that's it. That's the two. And that's how this needs to be a book about why don't we talk about this? And we see at the very beginning with Jasmine and her mom, why don't we talk about it? And then it expands out as Jasmine goes through this journey, she's meeting other people who don't talk about it either. And it is not a pandemic book, but it is certainly a pandemic metaphor. It is a metaphor for this. We just moved on and no one allowed like this sort of national period of grieving and mourning. We just and I get why, because we were all cooped up and it was a nightmare and we wanted back to our lives. But like, there wasn't this period where people could like actually process what had happened. And so for me, that's sort of the emotional core of Jasmine is Haunted.
I love that. And I do agree with you because I think, we had enough deniers in this country to sort of, let's say you lost someone, with 17 people, and then you encounter a denier, and it's like I just want to smack him right in the head, because I'm like, really? You not only I don't really care what a person believes. That's up to each individual.
Yeah.
My big thing is, don't come rain on my parade, even though the parade's not a happy parade. Don't come and try to deny that this happens, because it just cheapens life. Life is to be lived.
Yes. And even thinking about that, I think that's also the pain Jasmine has with her mom, is that this is happening and you know it's happening. And I loved that there is a point where Jasmine does get to confront her mom and be very honest about, like, this sucked. And I get it. I have like this empathy of like, oh, I get this, why this is, but also, mom, this sucked. Like, this really hurt. And being able to have a moment where a child can tell an adult, I don't like how you treated me, and then isn't punished, by the way.
Right.
Which is very important.
That's important.
Yes, it is. Was like, and her mom isn't perfect in her but it's still like, hold on, you don't get punished for this. Like, you need to be able to have a space to say, like, this thing that I did not go over well, to say lightly.
Well, and I think that's, as I said earlier about hope, I mean, that's the important thing about this book, is because people have this catharsis throughout this book, and they each reach it at a different point. But I think I noticed, you put Jasmine in a situation where she went to the GSA, and then she makes friends. She not only makes one friend, she makes two friends, but she feels comfortable enough to share. And I think that, just as you were talking about some of the children students that you encounter, how they will share with you. And it is, children always want to be believed. I mean, if adults could take one thing out of life, it is children desperately want to be believed. No matter what their story is, they want you to believe it.
So I love that you said that, because I actually think Jasmine is Haunted is sort of a spiritual sequel to my first middle grade. I was just grabbing copies. So I wrote, my first middle grade was called The Insiders. And the core of that story is about a kid who is bullied for being gay and tells an adult and isn't believed. So it is the other end of the spectrum, and what that pain is like, because that was what my middle school experience was like, was being bullied for being. I just had this conversation with a friend yesterday too, which was like, homophobic bullying is so specific, because it is a bullying that, as soon as that bullying is public and other people hear it, it's like a disease and it spreads. So people bully you by doing nothing, by just ignoring you, and that you're a social pariah. And it's this very fascinating thing. And so that book is about that very specific thing. But then I also was like, the other side of it is the weird thing in hindsight of, your bully was right, where you're like, that thing of like, they were perceptive enough to realize you didn't fit in these very specific ways. And most of the people I know, not all of them, because that's the other thing too, is because this society punishes people who act feminine, people who act outside of their gender expectations. There's a whole lot of misogyny wrapped up in the homophobia as well. There are people who are victims of this who actually are straight as well.
Yes.
So, but most of the time they're right.
And
I'm like, that's so wild to me, that their perception was right, but the way they chose to express it was in the most harmful way possible. So this book is, well, what if it's the other end of the spectrum, where these kids are going through something very difficult and they start telling people and they're believed. So it is, I mean, they're not connected in any other way, but for me, it was like, well, I've done this end of the spectrum. Let me try this other end. And what does a story look like where they are believed? Is there still tension? Is there still a mystery? Can you still do those things? So for me, it was kind of like an intellectual challenge.
Well, that does become a challenge, because, we all think of, if you sort of set up within reason a utopian society, then where is the conflict? But there can always be conflict.
Always.
All we got to do is open the front door, and there's conflict out there somewhere. It's waiting around the corner looking for us.
Absolutely.
So now, as a personal thing, do you believe in communing with the dead?
Oh, wow. No one has asked me about it, which is interesting, because I've written about spirits, the dead, multiple times at this point, with Jasmine is Haunted, with Percy Jackson book I did with Rick Riordan, Each of Us a Desert. I think I'm writing the fantasy I wish was real, to be very honest with you.
Okay, that's
Because
fair enough.
I have not had that experience, though I've tried. I think in particular, like when I think about the people I've lost in the last 5 years, I wish the ending of Jasmine is Haunted was real. That's where I'm writing. So now, actually, oh, I love that I'm unpacking this in real time. I kind of get why this book, I think more than anything I've ever written, feels so hopeful. Is I think I'm also, and I know, I don't think, I know I'm dealing with a lot of the grief that I have, that here is a way that I'm sort of expressing it, not only in a safe manner, I feel very safe writing and writing the things that I'm feeling, but in these characters and in this situation where not only everything is believed, but this desire to have closure on death is actually granted. Oh, that was an incredible, thank you. That took me out. I've never been asked that. Thank you.
Well, so I will share a little something. I try not to share too many things
Yeah.
because we're here for you and not for me. But when my mother died in 2017, I flew back to North Carolina to handle her estate. And I came to the end of the road and I could turn left to go to the county I was born in, or I'd turn right to go to the county she was currently living in. And I needed to work on a death certificate. And just as sure as I'm talking to you, my mother said to me, turn right. And I said, okay. And I turned right. And that was the right thing, because had I turned left, I would have been turned away, because you have to do it in the county that a person is currently living in. That's the only county you can get a death certificate.
Oh, wow.
So I'm a big believer. My parents never visit me, but I'm a big believer in like psychics and mediums who really have
I mean, well,
an
so
ability.
here's the thing, and this is not this because first of all, it's a very long story, but I do have a ghost story from my childhood.
Okay.
I think where I'm at is that I leave myself open to the possibility, but I have not, at least particularly with the dead that I know, like relatives, friends,
Right.
or whatnot. I have never had that sensation that like someone was visiting me or someone was communicating with me, like any of those, or like I hear lots of stories about people like after they pass, there's always like a weird coincidence or they see something, and so that hasn't happened yet. But I think I would like it to, and I think this book is like the exaggerated version of that.
I love it. I think that as humans, if we were more open to things
Yeah.
perhaps happening, we'd have a much more beautiful life. I'm about to fix everyone's life right here on this podcast.
I love it.
Oh, so do you do any schools in the South? Because I noticed you
All the
mentioned New
time.
York. Oh,
All
good.
the
Oh,
time.
I'm so happy
All
to
the
hear
time.
that.
Oh my God. Moving to Atlanta has made it a lot easier, first of all. Moving to Atlanta, actually, let me add another thing too, because this will make you laugh. I did not know how to drive until I moved here. Because
Okay, that's
I've been a
understandable.
city kid this whole time and always public transportation. So moving here forced me to learn how to drive. But then it actually just literally opened me up to the opportunity of being able to drive to places that don't have airports. So one of my favorite things about moving to the South is getting to do rural school visits. So I've done visits, up in northern Georgia, up in the mountains, like Gainesville area, which is like just below the Blue Ridge Mountains. A lot of visits in Alabama. Alabama, actually, I've done more visits in Alabama than I have here in Georgia, which is weird. But there's a school I visit every year in January, February. This will be my 4th year coming back. Yeah, I'm not going to say where it is because that's just for privacy reasons, but it is in the middle of nowhere. It is about 2.5 hours. We'll just say outside Birmingham.
Okay.
It is. I met the first year I went. There was literally a kid who was like, I've never seen like a Latino person in my entire life. Like these are all almost entirely white schools. These kids were feral over me. So excited. I mean, they were just like, do you draw on your, one kid asked me, do you draw on your tattoos every morning? And I was like, what? Wow. And so the thing is, they just have this wonderful teacher who's just an incredible English teacher who runs this book club. And so she brings me out every year. And every year we've switched books. We've done The Insiders. We've done You Only Live Once, David Bravo. This next year will be my first time doing Jasmine is Haunted. And I come in and I meet with like 40 to 50 kids, almost entirely a white school. Most, as far as I know, I mean, a few of the kids have come out to me, but not a whole lot. And so technically they're not my target audience. I don't care because I just care about who's reading. And when I tell you I have some of the most fulfilling school visits at this school in the middle of nothing. These are mostly farm kids. These are kids who just love weird things and they love stories. And a lot of them actually tell me, I don't want to be a writer when I grow up. Like, that's not my goal, but I love getting to think about this and have these conversations. And so I've absolutely become like a defender of the South since living here, because there's all these ideas of what it is like. And sure, some of the stereotypes hit true in certain places.
Sure.
There are places here in Georgia I don't go alone. Like, yes, absolutely.
Totally get it.
That being said, it is not what people say it is. And I have had some of the most fulfilling interactions with young readers here in the South. You know, I mean, that Charleston has Y'all Fest, one of the biggest young adult festivals in the entire world. Like, it is very much not the place people think it is. And so it's very important that I'm often, by the way, donating my time to do these schools, because these schools, like this teacher, she can pay me gas money. Like, that's about it. Like, a lot of these schools don't have a budget for that. They don't have, you know, the sort of oversight, or they have too much oversight, so they can't bring me in officially. Because there is a lot of book banning going on here, and concerned parents. So sometimes it's the things where I'm meeting off campus, or because it's extracurricular, it's okay to bring me in. So there are loopholes I have to go around. That often happens in Florida, because Florida is really difficult to do visits in, but I still do them. And I do them because I don't believe in punishing the kids and saying that the kids don't get to hear from someone and the kids don't get this experience because of what the adults are doing. And I do understand why there are some people who are like, I don't do events in Florida. I don't go to these places. And I get it. I understand it. But I think these kids are still missing out either way. So I'm going to choose the option, and will often choose the option where I don't get paid to make sure that it happens.
And you make a difference, Mark. That's the most important thing. I know, I can tell you do, because it's important. And it's also nice that some of these teachers are reaching out to you and saying they can make space, which is so incredible, because that's the teacher every queer kid needs in school desperately.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think about the teachers who made space for me, who, by the way, like after I didn't come out in high school, okay, it was after, but when I talked to them as adults, they were like, we were just waiting. We had the door was right here. Come on through. They all knew, like they were like, we weren't surprised. I'm like,
well, no, precisely. My high school English teacher told me that I was always the funny one, and I was never really certain exactly what funny she was saying. I think I do know what she knew. She knew as well. I mean, as you were talking about being bullied earlier, I think everyone in my high school knew I was queer except me. I was the only one that was sort of fighting it. But you know, I've managed to even the score a couple of times since high school, so I'm very proud of that.
Good.
Mark, do you have a website or social media you'd like to share?
Yes, it's very easy. MarkOshiro.com, spelled as you see on here, Oshiro. And then on social media, I'm only really on Instagram and Twitter at Mark Does Stuff. That's it. I keep a unified name across.
Love it.
So if you do find a TikTok account, that is me. I just don't really post. I consume TikToks. I do not make them. But generally, Instagram and Twitter is where you'll be able to find me posting, and I post about events and fun things and whatnot.
Wonderful. Again, the book is Jasmine is Haunted. Mark, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. What an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Dan.
Totally agree. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.